India's dream of replacing China as the world's factory. When Narendra Modi's government took power in 2014, it launched the Make in India initiative, an ambitious plan to replicate China's path to development. With China's rise threatening America's global dominance, the plan was immediately embraced by the Western media. Suddenly, talk of India replacing China was everywhere. But now, more than a decade later, despite the Indian government's support and the international community's favor, manufacturing's share of India's GDP has actually decreased. The once hyped theory of Made in India supplanting Made in China has become an international joke. So, where did India's much-lauded manufacturing plan go so wrong? Since the beginning of its reform and opening up, China quickly became a favorite of industrial capital, thanks to its vast supply of cheap, high-quality labor, its well-developed and government-subsidized infrastructure, and its stable pro-manufacturing policies. With the dual support of its government and international capital, China grew into the world's factory, supplying the globe with a wide variety of affordable, high-quality industrial goods. Initially, Western governments were happy with this arrangement. The cheap consumer goods from China helped keep their domestic inflation in check, which was good for social stability. But as China began to reinvest its economic gains into social and military development, translating wealth into national power, and as it pushed for industrial upgrades to reduce its dependence on Western capital and technology, the West grew uneasy. This anxiety turned to hostility as a powerful China began to take on more international responsibilities, actively helping developing nations improve themselves and making it harder for the West to extract wealth from the Third World. It became clear that China's rise posed a serious challenge to the hegemonic system on which the West's prosperity depended. But they had a problem. They couldn't find anyone else who could produce the sheer volume of industrial goods they needed. So no matter how wary they were, they had no choice but to grit their teeth and continue their economic cooperation with China. It was against this backdrop that Narendra Modi, who had won the 2014 election on the back of his economic success as the leader of Gujarat state, announced his Make in India campaign. The West was ecstatic. Modi's plan projected that Indian manufacturing would grow at an annual rate of 12 to 14% and create 100 million new jobs by 2022. If this had actually happened, India's manufacturing sector would have been able to compete head-to-head with China's.
Seeing a chance to finally break their dependence on Chinese manufacturing, Western governments rushed to sign trade and investment deals with India. The media was filled with breathless predictions of India becoming the new world's factory. And for a while, thanks to the combined efforts of the Modi government and the West, India's overall economic growth rate did see a welcome increase. But the Make in India plan itself was a spectacular failure. Manufacturing, the very sector Modi had championed, actually grew slower than the rest of the Indian economy. Its contribution to GDP fell from 15% in 2014 to just 13% in 2022. In fact, in only 1 year since the plan's launch did manufacturing growth even come close to the target. Worse, not only did the plan fail to create new jobs, but the manufacturing sector actually lost 15 million of them. At this point, even India itself doesn't seem to believe in the Make in India slogan anymore. In 2024, the opposition party openly called it a fraud, a policy tool for Modi's cronies. The West, which once had such high hopes, now feels deeply deceived. The international narrative has done a complete 180 from India is the next China to India is a hopeless case. But for anyone who understands India's history and social reality, the failure of its manufacturing ambitions comes as no surprise. Today, when people think of Made in India, they usually think of the country's comical failures in infrastructure and military production. But few realize that historically, India was once a manufacturing powerhouse. During the British colonial era, the UK built a relatively comprehensive transportation network to control the colony. By the early 20th century, India had the fourth largest railway system in the world. When the two world wars ravaged Europe, Britain, with its own production capacity crippled, turned to its colonies to supply its war machine. With its strategic location, rich natural resources, and existing infrastructure, India was the perfect choice. The British established major steel, chemical, and machinery industries there, and by World War II, India's industrial output was among the top 10 in the world. After independence, India inherited this entire industrial base. It should have been a great starting point, but the country's development was deeply disappointing. While the rest of the world experienced a post-war economic boom, India lagged far behind, with an anemic annual growth rate of 4%. To be fair, at least half of the blame for this early failure can be laid at the feet of its former colonial master. While the British built up India's industry, their rule was anything but benevolent. The exploitation was brutal. To feed Britain's war machine, India was forced to cut back on the production of basic necessities for its own people. Even during the devastating famine of 1943, which killed millions, the British refused to ease up. It's no wonder, then, that an independent India had a strong aversion to foreign investment.
But rejecting foreign capital doesn't have to mean stagnation. The Soviet Union and the newly founded People's Republic of China both faced Western boycotts and still achieved impressive results. And India had the advantage of a large territory, abundant resources, and an existing industrial base. In theory, if it had managed its resources well, it could have met its early development needs. India seemed to recognize this. After independence, it quickly decided to adopt the Soviet model of a planned economy. But there was a fatal flaw. India had never been a truly unified state. The British divide-and-conquer strategy had left a legacy of a weak central government with little control over the regions. When the central government tried to implement policies like land reform, which are essential for consolidating national resources but threatened the interests of local elites, it was met with fierce resistance and was ultimately forced to back down. The failure of land reform not only crippled the government's ability to extract resources from the agricultural sector, but also made acquiring land for industrial and infrastructure projects incredibly time-consuming and expensive. This resulted in painfully slow industrial development. So, while China laid the foundation for its industrialization with one 5-year plan, and the Soviet Union became an industrial superpower with 2, India, after 3 5-year plans, saw its economy grind to a halt. From 1950 to 1980, India's share of global industrial output fell from 1.2% to 0.7%, and its world ranking plummeted. And this was with the help of both superpowers, who were courting India as a major player in the Third World. When the Soviet Union collapsed, that support vanished. The U.S., no longer needing a counterweight, also scaled back its engagement. Then an oil price shock hit, and India's economy collapsed. Desperate, India turned to the IMF for aid and was forced to implement liberalization reforms and open its economy. And surprisingly, while IMF reforms are often poison for small countries, they actually had some positive effects in India. At least in terms of total GDP, India became one of the fastest-growing large economies in the world. But a closer look reveals that this growth was almost entirely driven by the service sector. Manufacturing remained stagnant. The deep-seated aversion to foreign capital never really went away. Foreign companies that did brave the Indian market faced a gauntlet of obstacles.
If they did manage to turn a profit, they were often hit with arbitrary fines from the government. Over time, the world learned the hard lesson of doing business in India. You can make money in India, but you can't take it home. Foreign investment dried up. Meanwhile, India's domestic companies, coddled by government protection, had little incentive to innovate, relying instead on their monopolies to make money. Even after Modi launched his Make in India plan in 2014, the underlying social and political factors that were holding the country back, the government mindset, the land tenure system, remained unresolved. On top of that, the infrastructure that had been a point of pride in the mid-20th century was now hopelessly outdated and couldn't support modern industrial development. And what little infrastructure there was had been so poorly maintained that in many places it was worse than it was 70 years ago. Given these conditions, it's no wonder India's manufacturing sector has failed to take off. In fact, a country with these problems had managed to become a manufacturing powerhouse. That would be the real mystery.